Well, good morning, everyone. This is Billy Trout with the Tennessee Department of Revenue's Taxpayer Services Education section. On behalf of our Commissioner, David Garagano, and our staff in Taxpayer Services, and I would like to say our Audit Division, on behalf of Mr. Thomas here, we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on nonprofits and how we handle taxation in Tennessee for nonprofits. So we want to welcome all the participants and throw you to the information that's on your screen right there on technical setups. Likely, if you're hearing me and seeing me, then you're good to go, and we're ready to go. And of course, we'll have a copy of this presentation posted to our website in recorded fashion, either later today or early tomorrow. We have contact information here at the bottom of this first slide, and this will be repeated at the end as well. We know that a lot of you will have questions today. Unfortunately, because we have a large number of participants like normal, then we will not be able to answer every question, but you will certainly be told how you can get your question answered and answered very quickly by our staff in our education section. So I want to welcome Mr. Thomas Meisenzahl from our audit division. Welcome, Thomas. Thank you for joining us today. Thomas will not be auditing all the people on the webinar today, so everybody can kind of relax a little bit. But Thomas is here to offer his expertise. And then, of course, we have Miss Katie Julian in our taxpayer education section who's going to walk you through the presentation and entertain questions as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn that over to Katie. And Katie, if you'll go ahead, and we thank everybody for participating today. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks, Billy. And again, thanks, Thomas, for being with us. They'll be back here in a few minutes when we open up for some Q&A. Right now, we have the chat to the panelists closed, but as soon as we walk through this, get done walking through the slides of the presentation, we'll open up the chat so that you can ask anyone on the panel any questions. So just kind of save your questions up till that point. And for those of you, I know we've got some people calling in today. If you want to download or pull up the PDF of the presentation that we've got, you can do so by following the link that we put in the chat, or also you can get to it by going to our homepage. It's actually the link that's right there in the middle of the page of the slide you see right now. Go to tn.gov/revenue, then click on taxpayer education and then tax webinars, and you'll be able to click here for today's presentation materials link there. So if you want to follow along that way, and like Billy said, we'll be posting a video of this later today or tomorrow. Excuse me. So moving ahead here, as Billy said, we're going to be talking about Tennessee tax exemptions and how nonprofits are handled with regards to tax exemptions and taxation in Tennessee. Just an overview here, nonprofit organizations operating in Tennessee may qualify for certain tax exemptions. We're going to talk about which tax types allow exemptions, what's exempt, what's not, how to qualify for exemption or qualifying for registration or renewal of exemptions, and then what do dealers and retailers need to know. We're going to share some resources with you, and like I said, we're going to be opening up about halfway through the hour here at about 9:30 Central Time for a Q&A chat session with Thomas and Billy, and you'll have an opportunity at that point to put your questions into the chat. So moving along here, we're going to start with sales tax. We'll switch gears a few times and talk about a couple of different tax types, but we're going to start off here talking about sales tax and the exemption that's available to nonprofits specifically for sales tax. So sales and use taxes are transactional taxes that are applied to the sale or use of tangible personal property, which we'll refer to as TPP, or specific services that are enumerated in Tennessee law. There are several sales and use tax exemptions that apply to nonprofit organizations, I'm sorry. Products and services are exempt from sales tax when sold or donated to nonprofit, religious, educational, and charitable institutions that have applied for and received the Tennessee Certificate of Exemption. We'll talk in just a few minutes about how to apply for that exemption. So again, just to repeat, products and services that are typically subject to sales tax are going to be exempt from that tax when sold or donated to these specific nonprofit organizations. The exemption applies to products and services that the nonprofit organization purchases for its use and consumption or to give away, not to sell. That's kind of a different beast, and we'll go into that. But as this last bullet here says, the exemption does not extend to sales of tangible personal property or services made by the nonprofits. Some sales could be exempt during certain temporary periods. We're going to detail all that here in a few minutes, but just the most important takeaway from the sales tax exemption for nonprofits is that it applies to products and services that the organization is going to use or give away. Now, to see what exactly which organizations qualify here, we're going to point you over to Tennessee Code Annotated 67-6-322 for details about specific organizations that qualify, such as churches, synagogues, colleges and schools, boys and girls clubs, etc. And then you're going to see 26 of the U.S. Code, Section 501C, for a description of the qualifying federal exempt entities. So using the exemption, step one, apply for the exemption with TDOR. That's an acronym for us, Tennessee Department of Revenue. We're going to detail how to do that here in a minute, but that's the first step. Just being a nonprofit doesn't allow you to get have the exemption from sales tax. You have to actually apply for an exemption certificate. Then, when you are purchasing goods or services that are subject to sales tax, you're going to present a current certificate of exemption, or you can also present a streamlined sales tax certificate that includes your Tennessee exemption number. Now, out-of-state 501c3 organizations can use your federal authorization to make these purchases exempt from sales tax in Tennessee. Very important. Number 3 on this list here is how to pay. If it's a cash sale, the receipt must include the purchaser's name and the amount of the sale. Most organizations are not going to pay with cash. Now, if it's made with a check or credit card, it has to be made in the exempt organization's, it has to be with the exempt organization's name on the card or on the check. The credit card must list the organization's name or organization's name and a signer, and the credit card must be billed directly to the exempt organization. So going to talk a little bit more about that here because it's an area that sometimes there's some confusion over. So an individual, let's say, paying with a personal check or a personal debit or credit card is not going to receive this exemption, even if the item that they're purchasing is for use by the nonprofit. It has to be in the name, the payment has to be in the name of the organization. Even if that individual that's paying with their personal card or personal check is going to be getting reimbursed, doesn't matter. Keep in mind that the check or card must be in the name of the exempt organization. Now, an example here would be a tax-exempt hospital employee leases a vehicle that the employee will use only in performing official hospital business, let's say. Tax-exempt hospital is not a cosigner or otherwise part of the sale, but even if the hospital is going to reimburse the employee for the monthly lease payments, doesn't matter. It has to be, the sale has to be in the name of the hospital with payment in the name of the hospital. Likewise, titling and registration of personal vehicles of employees of tax-exempt organizations are subject to sales and use tax. The employees are not considered tax-exempt entities. This includes, for example, the leader of a religious institution, such as a pastor of a church. There's going to be a vehicle that is purchased for church use. It has to be in the name of the church or any organization. All right, now we're going to talk about applying for this exemption. I've got a little snip here on this slide of the middle main part of the application. There's a link here if you've got the PDF open or if you check it out later. This links you directly over to the application for the sales tax exemption for nonprofits. Now, obviously, as with any application, it is very important that you complete all sections. The number one reason why these exemption applications are rejected is because not all the sections are complete. That means signing it, completing every section, required documentation. We'll detail that in a minute. That's really the biggest one. You have to know exactly what to attach. Now, when you pull up this application on our website by following this link, you're also going to see instructions that will detail what I'm about to tell you right here about required documentation. But again, you don't want to waste the time in getting this rejected and sent back to you if you don't attach the right stuff, right? So we're going to detail this right now. If you want to zoom in on your screen right now, you can push the little plus button to see the application a little closer. You can see for section A here, which is organizations listed under TCA 676322, you're going to need to list what your entity type is. And then also the required documentation there is going to be a copy of your charter, bylaws, and or any documentation that evidences the exempt activity. Sections B through G, if you're a qualifying organization under this, and this is the 501c3 organizations, you're going to need to provide documentation along with this application to us of the federal exemption that you've received, which my understanding is extensive process in and of itself to get that exemption from the IRS. But for B through G, all the 501c3s, just a copy of the documentation of your exemption through the IRS. H through I, and we're looking at federally chartered credit unions, Tennessee chartered credit unions. You're going to need a copy of the letter of the exemption issued by the National Credit Union Administration or a copy of the Tennessee charter as a credit union. And finally, Section J here under the type of exempt organization is the Tennessee Historic Property Preservation or Rehabilitation Entity. For that one, the required documentation is going to be a documentation of direct or indirect ownership by the nonprofit entity and a copy of the charter. So very important there that you include your documentation when you apply for this certificate of exemption for nonprofits. So here's a little snip of what the certificate actually looks like. You're going to need a separate certificate of exemption for each location that you have. So for the item that you're purchasing, if you have multiple locations for your nonprofit, multiple locations for your church, whatever it is, for each location, you're going to need a separate certificate of exemption. It's an automatic renewal every 4 years, and that is not 4 years from when you apply for the certificate. It's on a term like we're right now, 2023 is a renewal year for these certificates. Qualifications for an exemption are subject to review and verification upon audit. And very important here, if you do change addresses, change location addresses, you have to submit a new application. Go through that process again. So you may want to keep your old one handy, all the documentation you provided in case you need to reapply. Very important here, again, with this year being a renewal year for these certificates, if you zoom in here, you can see the effective date on this certificate. It says expiration date, I'm sorry, June 30th, 2023. We are right now about a month out from when your certificate expires is when we automatically, currently the process is we automatically send a new renewal, a new certificate to your organization. So make sure you keep your address up to date with us for mailing address and all that good stuff, because we will be sending it out to you around a month out from when your certificate expires. Just one other thing to note here, once you do apply for this exemption, in most cases, if we've received all of the necessary documents required, then it will take about 3 to 5 days for us to process your application for exemption. One other thing to note is that misuse of an exemption certificate can result in not only a tax assessment, but also potential revocation of the exemption certificate. So definitely want to make sure you understand how you're supposed to use the certificate, which we're going over in this webinar. For anyone that's confused about that, it's real important that you use it correctly. All right, so up to this point, we've talked about how to purchase items that you're going to use for your nonprofit or give away tax-free. You're not going to have to pay sales tax on those things. When a nonprofit makes sales of items, which oftentimes they do, you must register for and collect sales tax on those items. There are a few exemptions here. The main one is a temporary sales period. If a nonprofit organization only sells goods or services during one or two temporary selling periods, each one lasting 30 days or less, you're not required to register to collect sales tax on those sales. So 1 to 2 temporary periods, don't worry about getting a sales tax account, collecting and remitting sales tax. Outside of that, we will talk about a few other exceptions here to the rule, but if you regularly sell items through your nonprofit outside of temporary periods, most likely you're going to need to register to collect sales tax. Items sold directly to consumers by the Girl Scouts, and this is in our law, or at county fairs for no more than 2 temporary sales periods are also excluded from needing to register for and collect sales tax. Items sold directly to consumers by a volunteer fire department for no more than 4 temporary sales periods are excluded. And again, those temporary periods are always going to be 30 days or less. More about exclusions to needing to collect sales tax for nonprofits. Items sold by charitable organizations whose primary purpose is fundraising in support of a local library, a city, county, or metropolitan library. Those sales must not exceed 300,000 per calendar year, and the election by the charitable organization must remain in effect for at least 4 years, again, to be excluded from needing to collect sales tax. Items sold by a community foundation are also excluded. Sales should take place during no more than 2 auctions, which last no more than 24 hours in each county designated to receive that support. All right, here's a big one here. K through 12 public and private schools and school support groups must pay tax to their vendors on the purchase price of products or services that are intended for resale, but the resale of such products and services are not subject to sales tax. This is very common for school support. You've got booster clubs, that type of thing. Um, Pay tax on the item that you're going to sell, but you do not need to charge sales tax. Persons operating any vending. Thomas, do you have something to add to that one?
Yeah, I just want to add real quick, Katie, that for K through 12 public schools and private schools, you have to be careful with these because it is for the school and school only. We talked about booster clubs and stuff like that. You have to make sure that if you are a booster club or you are an organization, if you are affiliated with the school, you have to have an affiliation letter, which all schools will give you, to use their tax exempt form. Now, junior leagues, such as your elementary school sports, your second through, I think it's what, sixth grade right now, or junior league sports, your basketball, your little league football programs, 9 times out of 10, those are not affiliated with your school. Even though it has your school name, they are not affiliated with your school. The school might let you use them, but there's no participation or activity with the school, and you do not qualify for the school's 501c3, which you will then have to separately file as a separate 501c3 to qualify for the exemption.
Thank you for outlining that. That's so those specific organizations would go through the whole process of being their own 501c3, not be able to use the school's exemption there.
That is correct.
Very common, those organizations too. Great organizations, but a little more legwork they've got to do to qualify for themselves.
Yes.
Anything else to add on the school events or support groups, Thomas? I know that's something that people have a lot of questions about.
Yeah, it's got to be affiliated or through the school system. And what I
Okay.
mean by affiliated is the money or books and records are kept by the school, by the school bookkeeper. Um, high schools have a lot of booster clubs, your band boosters, your football boosters. Um, like at our local high schools, those booster clubs are run through the school books and records. So any money that they bring in, it goes through the school account and it's through the school's bank account. But a lot of our junior league systems, your little league, um, footballs, your basketball, cheerleading, stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
um, those are not affiliated with the school because none of that is run through the school's books and records. They're just using their facilities at little to no charge. So those junior leagues, that's a big thing that we're dealing with right now is making sure that those groups are their separate 501c3s and using their own exemption. Now, they also have to follow, those junior leagues still have to follow the same laws and rules that the schools follow and that any other nonprofit follows, that you can't use personal debit and credit cards to do it, to make purchases. If you are selling items, concessions, for example, you have to be careful because if it's more than 30 days in 2 periods in a year, you have to charge and remit sales and use tax on those purchases, because you can purchase those items tax exempt then. So there's a lot of things you have to consider. In audit, we like to call it playing 20 questions.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is cut and dry. So you have to ask yourself those questions, and we'd be more than glad to dive in deeper with those specific taxpayers or your clients or whoever, one on one. If you can call our taxpayer services division, they'd be glad to walk you through that process because everybody's just a little different. There's not one group that is the same.
Just to kind of tag on to what Thomas said here too, it's probably important to realize that even though we're talking about who needs to be collecting tax or not collecting tax in these situations, is that we're not telling the organizations what they need to do or not do. Only thing we're trying to mention here is the tax collection aspect of what they're doing. Okay. So, in other words, if you have more events that would make it taxable, then just charge sales tax, and go ahead and remit the sales tax back to us as state law provides, and then you'll be fine, as far as that goes. Just ensure that, of course, that if you're trying to raise funds for an organization or whatever, that your pricing is such that you're getting, good profit so that you guys are making money and everything. But the state, under state law, we do have to protect what the Tennessee legislature has passed as it relates to these laws. So that's just what I wanted to point out. Okay. Katie, you're muted.
Well, I just said some really important stuff and none of you heard it. I was just saying, Billy, a good point about you can price your items accordingly. So going back to this first bullet here, for a school support group, you're going to pay sales tax when you buy what you're going to be reselling here, but can price that for resale. You can price it at whatever you want to price it at, right? So if it's a fundraiser, you may want to bump it up. That's your prerogative. But when you are going to be paying sales tax on the purchase that you make, but don't have to charge sales tax when you sell it. Um, up that price, raise some funds, right? For these good groups. Okay, moving on here. The second bullet: persons operating any vending machine for the benefit of a charitable nonprofit organization, where the merchandise is being sold for 25 cents or less, may opt to pay the gross receipts tax instead of sales tax. Online access to continuing education courses offered by 501c3 and 36 organizations that meet regulatory requirements are also excluded from needing to charge sales tax on items that they sell. Okay, moving along here into dues, fees, and admissions charges. Dues and fees are exempt from sales tax for qualifying nonprofit organizations. Admissions charges to entertainment facilities, activities, or events held for or sponsored by the nonprofits are also exempt from sales tax. And I know when we were talking about this the other day, Thomas, if you wanted to hop in here to explain the difference between when the nonprofit is actually the ones collecting the admissions charges. There's a big difference there than if, let's say, for example, Ticketmaster is the one collecting those fees, right?
Yeah, so when you have events like this, and you've got to be careful with who's ultimately collecting the money and who is ultimately selling the tickets. Um, you know, we do these fundraisers for football teams or etc. Or Susan G. Komen, for example, um, holds a benefit dinner or holds a concert or they have their race or whatever. When you register for that, you're going through their website, their proxies to register and file all that. But if you go to, you go to Neyland Stadium, you go to the Titan Stadium, you go to Memphis to the Grizzly Stadium, and go to a benefit concert or something like that, you've got to be careful with who is actually selling those tickets. Is it Ticketmaster, StubHub, SeatGeek, etc., or is it truly through that organization? So that's one thing that you have to be careful with. Your smaller 501c3s, your Lions Club, your Key Clubs, your Kiwanis that sell their tickets, those are in house. 9 times out of 10, they're not using a ticket provider to do that. But just make sure that's another question you have to ask yourself is who's actually charging and collecting those fees for the admissions.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. We're going to talk for just a minute here about auctions. Sales of auction items that are donated for nonprofit auction events are considered what we call occasional and isolated sales during a specific tax year if they would meet the following requirements. The sales must be made directly to consumers. Sales must be made during temporary sales periods that year. The taxpayer must have no more than 2 temporary sales periods, and those sales periods cannot exceed 30 consecutive days in duration. Meet all those qualifications, it's just considered casual and isolated. No sales tax needs to be collected by the organization and then remitted to us. Just no sales tax there if you meet these 4 criteria for an auction. Okay, we're going to switch gears here. So in your brain, we've just talked about sales tax, nonprofits purchasing products without paying tax on them if they're going to use or give them away, when a nonprofit should charge sales tax on something that they're selling and when they don't need to. Okay, put that away for a moment. Now we're going to talk about a different tax type. We're going to talk about business tax. The business tax is a tax on the privilege of doing business by making sales of tangible personal property or taxable services in Tennessee. Anyone doing business in the state is subject to the state level business tax unless specifically exempt. That's where nonprofits come into play here. So business tax does not apply to the following. There are lots of organizations or certain scenarios where business tax does not apply. We're just going to be talking about the nonprofit side of this here. So it does not apply to nonprofits whose only taxable business activity is conducted at Tennessee State Fair or County Fair. It does not apply to persons conducting shows, displays, or exhibits sponsored by any nonprofit organization of gun collectors. Business tax does not apply to services rendered by nonprofit membership organizations. Services, and we're going to spend a minute here on this one. Business tax does not apply to services rendered by nonprofits, but if the nonprofit organization makes sales of food, beverages, items, tangible personal property, those are going to be subject to business tax. An example there would be, let's say there's a church. Excuse me. Any of the services that the church has not subject to business tax. But if that church has, let's say, for example, a bookstore, the income that is the gross receipts and gross income that is derived from the sale of the books or items at the bookstore, the church bookstore, those gross receipts would be subject to business tax and the business tax laws. Services furnished by nonprofit educational and research agencies are not subject to business tax. Services by religious and charitable organizations not subject to business tax. Again, with regards to business tax, qualified amusement activities we'll talk about for a minute here. gross proceeds from admissions to amusement or recreational activities conducted, produced, or provided by these organizations are exempt from business tax. Nonprofit museums, nonprofit entities operating historical sites and nonprofit historical societies, organizations that have received and currently hold 501c3 exemption from the IRS, and organizations operating on a membership basis for the promotion of interests for their members. This exemption does not apply unless these entities control the entire amusement or recreation activity. So just to recap business tax there, it's pretty simple. Again, you're not going to need to, for those of you that understand the business tax aspect that it is tied into your business license, you're not going to need a business license if you're one of these organizations and you're not selling goods for the most part. We are going to show you here in a few minutes a great manual, great resource that's going to go into more detail for you about this. We didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on business tax or F&E, which we're going into in just a minute, since it's pretty cut and dry, but there are some caveats there that you may want to research a little further on your own. Again, like I said, we're not going to dive too deep into the exemption for F&E taxes. F&E, franchise and excise tax, it's levied upon corporations, S corporations, limited liability companies, limited partnerships, and business trusts for the privilege of doing business or registering to do business in Tennessee. So nonprofits are generally exempt from F&E tax unless they derive taxable income from unrelated trade or business activity pursuant to the Internal Revenue Code 512 or are subject to federal income tax under Subtitle A. So we've got some resources there to look up how that's specifically defined as well in our nonprofit manual that we'll show you here in just a minute. More information about what an unrelated trade or business activity would be, but just keep in mind that if you're a nonprofit, you are generally exempt from F&E tax. Another aspect of F&E tax, for businesses that are subject to F&E tax, there are some incentives for charitable giving. In Tennessee, we provide certain incentives in the form of excise tax deductions to encourage charitable giving to eligible entities. With regards to this, the federal charitable contributions deduction, Tennessee generally conforms to this deduction with two major exceptions. The first is that the taxpayer is permitted to deduct all bona fide contributions expensed and paid in a given year without regard to any percentage limitations imposed under federal law. And two, Tennessee permits only the book basis of property donated to charity as a deduction in determining net earnings for the purpose of computing excise tax. Lots more detail about that in our manual as well. Tennessee monetary donations deduction, we provide an excise tax deduction equal to 75% of the value of monetary donations made to certain eligible entities, and the taxpayer may be able to deduct 175% of the value of a monetary donation. The following are eligible entities for purposes of this deduction: nonprofits, associations or organizations, or basically 501c3s, also 501c4 and 501c5s. Lots more information about that in our manual for you to dive a little deeper into. All right, alcohol tax. Nonprofit organizations may occasionally host fundraisers or other events where they serve alcoholic beverages, wine, beer, etc. Selling alcoholic beverages is highly regulated, not by us, by the TABC, the Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission. They may issue a special license to a nonprofit organization to sell alcoholic beverages at a fundraising event. Again, you would reach out to the Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission about that. Nonprofits that hold this license through the ABC and sell alcoholic beverages pursuant to that license do not owe the liquor by the drink tax on those sales. A person who sells alcoholic beverages directly to a nonprofit organization or government entity for its own consumption on premises must collect and remit liquor by the drink tax, though. But they would not have to collect sales tax on those purchases. Again, a little bit more about the special licenses. If the event is produced by another entity, the event will not qualify for a license, even if the proceeds are later donated to a nonprofit organization. The license is only valid for one 24-hour period, and a nonprofit organization is eligible for a maximum of 12 of these licenses in a calendar year. Lots more restrictions, requirements, details about this license that's issued by the ABC, and there's a link here to more information about the special event licenses. They may not, special occasion licensees may not purchase alcoholic beverages at wholesale, important to note there. And they can either accept donated alcoholic beverages or purchase the beverages at retail. Purchases from retailers are not considered wholesale sales and not subject to the gallonage tax. Okay, here's what I've been talking about. We are so excited about this new resource that we've got. Just came out this week or last week. It is a manual that we've got that is all about Tennessee taxation of nonprofit organizations. This manual will dive way deeper into all the topics we just discussed. I'm actually going to take you over to our website now and show you where you can find that manual as well as our other manuals. And before I do that, actually, I'm going to go ahead on in and open up the, excuse me, my allergies are really kicking this morning. I'm going to open up the chat for you to send questions to this panel for anything regarding taxation of nonprofits. There we go. Chat should be open now. And while we're opening that up, I'm going to take you over to our website real quick. Go on a little field trip here. Can y'all see my browser, my internet browser?
Yes, we can, Katie.
Okay, moving it over to the screen in front of me. So great. All right. Excuse me. So we're on our homepage here, which is tn.gov/revenue. Before I take you over to where the manuals are, I'm going to show you real quick where you can view a recording, because I know we do, like I said, have a lot of dial-in, call-in people on this webinar. From our homepage, if you go down to Taxpayer Education and Outreach tile here, this is where you would have clicked to register for this webinar. So you've been there. This is also where you will go. Let's see here, tax webinar here, tax webinars, click there. Scroll down a little bit. This is where you registered. You can see our upcoming webinars. Last Tuesday of every month, we have a webinar. Next month is Tennessee state tax issues for the Tennessee's hospitality industry. If you keep on scrolling down here, you'll see this webinar video library. This is where this presentation that we're giving today will be posted tomorrow, and where you can find all of our other webinars. Looks like there's 47. We've done 47 of these. That's crazy. Great resources here, though. So if you need a little bit more information about basics or dive a little deeper into any topic, always check our webinar archive for that. All right, going back up to the top, going back to the Department of Revenue's homepage, tn.gov/revenue. If you go under tax resources and then tax guidance, the very first link under tax resources, I'm going to click there. You'll see over on the left-hand side, there's several other pages you can go to. We're going to click on tax manuals and go over here. You see we've got an alcohol tax manual, business tax manual. This is our agricultural manual, F&E on down here. And then I'm going to click on industry-specific guidance. This is where you're going to see the taxation for nonprofit organizations. I'm going to actually, another great one, we're going to have a webinar about this coming up in the pretty near future, taxation for short-term rental units. But I'm going to click on the nonprofit manual here. It's 40 pages long, you'll see. Not to scroll all the way through it, but just some basics here. There's a whole section, a whole chapter on sales and use tax and how it applies to nonprofits. Then business tax, excuse me, business tax, F&E tax, and some other taxes there. A lot more information if you need that. I'll go ahead and put that link directly to it in our chat as well. And let's see here. We'll kind of land, Billy and Thomas, if you want to come back in. I see that a lot of chats are coming up here. I
They
haven't been
must be
looking at him because I've
listening.
been
They must be
talking.
listening to you, Katie. How about that?
Yeah? Are
Yeah.
they coming directly through to me or are they going to all of us?
No, they're coming to, well, I don't know. I see them.
Okay,
How
good.
about
There's
that?
a lot of questions, Katie, about the auto renewal of the certificates. If you want to hit that first, and then we'll kind of
Ooh,
dive
I
more
want to.
into.
I want to do
Billy,
it.
you're up. You're up.
Okay, my fingers are sore even from last week from answering so many emails about the certificates. Here you go. Here it is. Relax. They're coming out. Okay. So, long story short, we do send these out ahead of the expiration. The expiration is June 30th. So we know that's coming up in a month. We get it, right? But what we have found out over the many, many years that we've done this is that when you send out things early to our good old taxpayers, I'm certainly not talking about you good folks, but people tend to lose things. And when they lose things, they tend to re-request things. So we have a intricate system so that we are sending all of these out in the next week or two to you guys. Okay. So the one thing you want to be sure of is if your address has changed, for whatever reason, you do want to contact us. Okay. So you can send us an email, a help desk ticket, things like that, and we can help you on an address change prior to the printing. Okay. That's really important. Okay. But if your address is the same, everything's kind of still perfect, no worries. It'll come to you. Okay. So that's it. And I appreciate Thomas bringing that up too. But we have gotten a ton of questions about that. And I get that. If I was in your shoes too, I would have the same question because I'd be kind of worried about it. But I know your vendors are asking for that information now. Well, sorry, we just need to kind of wait just a little bit and we will get them on out, I promise. Okay. What else do we have to talk about? Lots of
This is a good
interesting
question.
questions.
Holly says, how do you apply for the exemption for business tax? If business tax does not apply to your organization, you don't have to apply for the exemption. You just don't need to register for business tax. In your situation, Holly, you say there the agency was set up incorrectly and looks like it's been paying business tax. That gets a little trickier. It's kind of harder to briefly explain that, but basically, if you've been paying business tax and shouldn't have, because you were set up incorrectly, Billy, correct me if I'm wrong here. First and foremost, let's go ahead and close it down. If you've been registered for it incorrectly and paying for it, you can go in and amend past returns. To reflect zero gross sales. If that was the case, there's still a minimum business tax, which is $22 per license. But if you have business tax and don't need it, first thing to do is to close it out, right, Billy?
That's right. But the other thing you can do on TinTap when you're closing the account out is to file a claim for refund,
Mm-hmm.
and you can go back. I guess we go back 3 years, Thomas. Is that right?
Yeah, 3 plus the current.
Plus the current. That's exactly right. So 3 plus current, we can go back and actually refund you money on that. And then, of course, in your claim for refund, which by the way, I really recommend you doing that on the TinTap system versus sending in a paper form. We are able to get back to you as quick as possible on your refund claim that way. And if they have any questions, they'll reach out to you by email or phone and get that taken care of. And we're very happy to refund people money who've paid us incorrectly. We don't want to keep your money if you didn't really owe it. So certainly we're glad to work with you on that. Trying to think of other things
Okay,
that are
I
out
just
here.
want to clarify. I've seen a ton of questions about selling merchandise or t-shirts or etc. If you are a nonprofit, I don't care, Boys and Girls Club, churches, whatever. If you are selling t-shirts, though, if you are selling them outside of a 30-day period, somebody put on here, if I have a website, if it's more than 30 days for 2 periods in the year, you must collect sales and use tax. Um, you will, they will get you on that. So please make sure that anything that you sell, regardless, somebody asked even if it wasn't Girl Scouts, The only reason we mention Girl Scouts is because it's specifically stated in the law in our TCA that Girl Scouts, because they were the pusher for this event or for this exemption. But I know Boy Scouts, they sell or used to sell popcorn. Um, that's the same thing. Fundraisers, different things like that. If you were selling stuff, T-shirts, whatever, tote bags, watches, whatever, it can't be more than the temporary sale period of 2 periods or more for 30 days.
Yeah, and Thomas, I think what's important on that is to just kind of sit back and think about that for just a second. So, if you are a nonprofit organization, the state is not taxing you in normal things that you do for nonprofit, like your dues that you might collect, or if you're a church on tithes and offerings and things of that nature. But when you're engaged in selling tangible personal property, you're kind of acting like the store down the street, okay? Like a department store that sells clothing and you're selling clothing too. Isn't that the same thing? Yeah, it is, quite honestly. That's what we're trying to get to. And of course, outside of these 30-day periods here, that's when it gets a little bit tricky. And when you just have to say, okay, if we're going to really be doing this, we just need to register for sales tax. We need to collect the sales tax appropriately and go ahead and get it set up, and then everybody's okay. We're not wanting to cost people more money necessarily outside of what the law allows, that's for sure, but it's important to just comply with what the law says.
Yeah, somebody just commented, Billy, can I call it a donation? No.
No.
Uh, that is a big thing, and you will get hit if you try to change your wording to say, well, it's a donation for this book or for this t-shirt. Um, Tennessee law clearly states in 67.6.102 what the definition of a sales price is and what consideration is. So when you are transferring possession of items for sale, that is consideration. It doesn't matter what you call it. So just make sure that it's within those 2 periods, and then you'll be fine.
Right.
Another big question that I keep seeing is the sales tax holiday. We have multiple sales tax holidays. Um, we have one for food. We have, I don't think the gun safe one got renewed this year, but I
It
could
did
be
not.
wrong.
It did not. But I think the one that I had responded to one of our participants on was on clothing. And of course, for the whole group, I'll just go ahead and mention it. The sales tax holiday at the end of July still applies, and clothing items $100 or less are exempt. Um, and as Thomas might agree with me on this, you really don't. It doesn't matter who the seller is. It could be a clothing store, it could be the nonprofit, it could be whoever. So if you're selling clothing during that period, it is exempt under state law. So you're good at that point, but still want to make sure that you're in compliance with the regular periods and the things that Katie has circled here on the slide.
Yeah, just make sure. But the clothing is July 28th through Sunday, July 30th this year. So
Yes,
it's always the last week of July.
the last full weekend, including Friday. I learned that
Yes.
from a couple of years ago because it was sort of weird the way the calendar fell out that one year. By the way, it used to be in August, and the legislature had it in August, and then they moved it to July. And then we would get questions about, why did you move it to July? Well, it's because the legislature moved it to July. Well, why did they do that? I don't know. Ask them. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what life is like in the good old Department of Revenue sometimes. But that's okay. We do what we say, what the legislature says. How about that? And then we let you guys know about it.
There you go. Another question that I keep seeing a bunch of is giveaway or free item. So somebody asked what's the definition of giveaway, and somebody's asking about giving items away. So the big thing about giveaways are there is no consideration. So you are the 501c3 can purchase those items tax exempt and then just give them away. And that is something that tangible personal property, which is something you can touch, see, feel, smell, weigh, whatever, and you give it away with no consideration to receive a donation or payment for. So a lot of your churches, I'll use churches for an example because we see this a lot, but churches, they'll give away either coffee cups or, a t-shirt to their youth group, or they'll give away coffee cups to new people that come and visit, or pens or stuff like that. That stuff you can give away and there's no tax collected. It's when you start charging for it, that's when you get into the whole consideration argument definition. So if you're giving it away with no intention to receive a donation or to charge for it, then it's all tax exempt. You're good as gold to buy it on your exemption certificate and give it much away as you want. You can send us, no, please don't send us one.
That's a
'Cause
joke, people.
please do not send us your stuff because we legally cannot accept it.
Right. Right.
We are bound by
Exactly.
law that we cannot accept it because then it's classified as a bribe and then we get in trouble.
Yeah, we're not doing that, people. Understand.
But Thomas, back to your point of when you're going to be selling it, even if it's just to cover your costs, which I saw a question there about if you are going to be selling it, that's kind of where what Thomas mentioned was the 20 questions come in. There are so many different factors. It can be very cut and dry. For example, if you're just selling it, let's see, which slide is that? During those 1 or 2 temporary sales periods, that's pretty cut and dry, but there's just so many other caveats here, right? Where lots of questions that we have to ask. And again, we're here if you've got those questions. But you're going to have to charge sales tax if it's outside of these things that we specifically mention here. If you're a nonprofit and you're selling something.
Right. I want to bring up one topic here. And Katie, if you mentioned this in your presentation, I apologize if I'm going to repeat it. But motor vehicles for nonprofits. So typically we get a lot of, when I say a lot, several questions anyway, about churches that will buy a motor vehicle for the use of their church. That's perfectly fine. That's a proper use of your nonprofit exemption. Okay, it's tangible personal property for the use of your organization. What you want to be careful about, though, is the titling of that vehicle. Okay, so if your pastor is there at the church, you wouldn't want to put the pastor's name on the title. You just want to leave the title in the name of your organization. Okay, because that way the exemption is very clear and there's no subject to taxation just because you happen to tie this into an individual, in this case the pastor. Okay, so just be very careful about that, because we want you to maintain your exemption and to use it in its proper manner. Certainly, I believe that motor vehicle law allows anyone with a valid driver's license to operate a vehicle and make sure your insurance is right and all that kind of good stuff. But, clearly you just want to keep that titling very clean. Okay. Make sure that exemption is nice and tight for you. All right.
Yeah.
Someone else mentioned on churches too about construction stuff. That is a very complicated area. There's information in the tax manual on that and also in the general sales tax manual too. I'll refer you over to that. If you have specific questions about that, we want you to email those in to us. We can dig for you. Not to avoid the question at all. It's a very good question, but there's certain technicalities on that about whether it's church meeting space versus other space, and if it's it ties into other sorts of aspects that we have to kind of dig a little bit on. Okay.
Yeah, by no means we're trying to avoid that conversation, but that opens a whole can of worms. And
That's about 50 questions, Thomas, as opposed to 20 questions.
every bit of 50 questions just skimming the surface there.
Yeah, it's a little
Right.
deep.
I do see a few questions about what if we are the charter of a Boy Scout club or a Boys and Girls Club, and can they use our exemption? And make sure that it's clearly defined. Do not, you have to be really careful on those. Because if you're, a church or an organization that is going to charter or sponsor a club, you have to be very careful with that. It needs to be a clean line that of who really holds the 501c3 exemption. Like I talked about with the schools again, a lot of your extracurriculars at schools are not school sponsored, so they have to qualify themselves. I'll give you an I'll give you a clearer example. In Tennessee, we have the Tennessee Bass Nations Association for Fishing, and that is a club sport. It is not sponsored through the school system. So I have set up a 501c3 for my team so they can get their stuff tax exempt and that they can take in donations and people can get tax exempt on their federal returns. Since it is not affiliated with the school, we are allowed to use the school name, but it's not a sponsored, not a sport or a sponsored club through the school. We have to file for our own 501c3. And let me tell you, that is not a fun, easy task. That is a lot of paperwork, a lot of money. So please make sure that you have that cut and dry and don't try to cheat the system and hold out, because you won't get in trouble with just us. You will lose your 501c3 or potentially could with the IRS as well.
And for those of you that have not applied, excuse me, for a 501c3 to the Internal Revenue Service, the application for nonprofit status with the IRS is a very cumbersome sort of thing. You do want to think about what you're doing. You want to be very sure that you're handling the paperwork that's required at the federal level. There are fees involved. Okay. So make sure you research that and understand what you're doing before you get involved with it. It's not easy, but it can be done. And then, of course, once you achieve your 501 status with the Internal Revenue Service, then depending on what subsection you're under, you can come back to us and make the application for that. And of course, there are other nonprofits that don't require the application to the Internal Revenue Service as well too. But that's all detailed in that fabulous manual, don't you know, that Katie had talked about, right?
We are running out of time here. This went by really quick. Got just a minute left here. Any parting advice, words, Billy, Thomas, y'all have got on this topic or life in general?
We don't have time for all of that.
Farms are different than exempt nonprofit 501c3s.
Yes, a
Okay.
farm is a farm. So you have a farmer's exemption, and then you have nonprofits as well. But
Right.
but anyway, you know, the resources here, Kate, that Katie has up on the screen, super important. Email us, call us, and just reach out to us any way that you'd like to. Refer to these manuals; they're fabulous. But still, at the same time, when you have specific questions, let us know, and we're here to help you out. We want to make sure that you're only paying the exact amount of tax that you need to, and that you enjoy every exemption that the law provides.
Right. There were lots of questions we weren't able to get to, of course. Hundreds of people in here. So if you can't find your answer in our manual or on our website, again, like Billy said, reach out to us. Any of these ways, you can email us here, call us. I want to say a couple people have mentioned getting CPE credit if you're a CPA or an accountant. As you're exiting the event, you can, on the survey, mention yes, you want CPE credit. We'll get it to you. If you're dialing in, you may not get that survey. I learned that after our last webinar. If that's the case, you can always go to our website, which to go to our tax webinars page where I pointed you to earlier, where you registered for this and where you can go to the webinar video library. In the middle of that page, there is a section to fill out for getting CPE credit. One more quick question someone had about getting the video to today's presentation. That's where you'd find it too, on that tax webinars web page at the very bottom in the video archives. So thanks y'all for being here. Thomas, thanks for being our special subject matter expert. We always love having audit involved here. I know our participants too. It's a pleasure to have you.
No problem. Thank you all for
Thank you
having
very
us.
much.
All right,
Have a
y'all.
good day, everyone.
We'll see you next month. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.